The morning Dorothy Yates rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with a Winchester rifle across her saddle, and a look in her eyes that could freeze a rattlesnake mid-strike. Every man on the main street had the good sense to step back and give her room. It was the spring of 1879, and Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a cattle town that smelled of dust and manure and possibility, where fortunes were made and lost over card tables, and the wind came howling down from the north like it had a personal grudge against every soul who had dared to settle there. The town was a rough collection of wooden storefronts, a couple of saloons, a livery stable, a general store, and a small hotel that leaned slightly to one side as though it were perpetually tired. The streets were wide and unpaved, and in dry weather they were rivers of fine brown dust that coated everything and everyone within half a mile. Dorothy was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of creek water running over smooth stones, somewhere between green and gray depending on the light. She was lean and sun-browned from 2 years of working cattle drives between Texas and the Kansas border, and there was nothing soft or hesitant in the way she carried herself. She had learned early that softness got you hurt out here, and hesitation got you dead. She had come to Caldwell on business. Her business, specifically, which was acquiring horses. Dorothy ran a modest operation buying and reselling quality horses to ranchers and trail bosses who needed reliable animals for the long drives north. She had an eye for horseflesh that most men twice her age lacked, and she had built a reputation along the trail as someone who dealt fair and delivered what she promised. It was not a glamorous enterprise. It was hard, lonely, and occasionally dangerous work, but it was hers, completely and without apology. She did not need a man. She had made that point clearly and consistently to every eligible bachelor from San Antonio to Wichita who had ever got the idea that a woman riding alone must be in need of rescue or companionship or the blessing of a wedding ring. She had told them all the same thing in varying degrees of directness. She was not the marrying kind. She had a life and it suited her, and she was not interested in trading it for someone else's idea of what her life ought to look like. The man who would eventually change that thinking was not waiting for her in Caldwell. He had not set out to change anything. He had, in fact, been having what he would later describe as the worst week of his professional life, and on the morning Dorothy rode into town, Owen Atkins was standing outside the livery stable on the south end of Main Street, engaged in a heated argument with a man named Clyde Barris who owed him $40 and showed absolutely no sign of intending to pay it. Owen was 30 years old, tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown too long at the collar and jaw stubble that had moved past the point of being intentional. He had an honest face, the kind that people trusted immediately, with deep-set brown eyes that carried a permanent quality of watching and measuring that came from years of reading men in difficult situations. He had been a deputy marshal in Dodge City for 3 years before the appointment ended, and then a hired ranch hand for another year, and now he worked as an independent horse trader much like Dorothy, though he specialized in breaking and selling working horses to the military posts scattered across the Kansas and Indian Territory borderlands. He was not thinking about women. He was thinking about the $40 and whether Clyde Barris was going to make him do something unpleasant to get it. Dorothy pulled her horse up at the water trough across the street from the livery, swung down with practiced ease, and let the animal drink while she surveyed the town. She registered the argument outside the stable without particular interest. Arguments outside stables were as common as the flies that circled above them. She was more interested in the animals she could see penned in the corral behind the building. There were 8 or 9 horses visible from where she stood, and 2 of them looked like they had good bone structure and sound legs. She tied her horse loosely to the hitching post, dropped her saddlebags across her shoulder, and walked toward the livery. Clyde Barris saw her coming before Owen did. Barris was a short, barrel-chested man with a red face and small eyes set close together, and he had the instinct of a man who had spent his life looking for opportunities to shift trouble onto someone else. He recognized in Dorothy the possibility of a distraction and turned to address her with the kind of automatic, dismissive cheerfulness that small men deployed when they wanted to appear harmless. "Morning, miss. You looking to stable your animal?" Dorothy did not answer him directly. She looked past him at the corral. "Those two roan mares at the back. Who owns them?" Barris blinked. "Well now, those aren't for sale at present. I was not asking if they were for sale. I asked who owned them." Owen had turned to look at her by now. He had stopped thinking about the $40. She was not beautiful in the way that the illustrated papers depicted women out east, all soft curves and delicate features framed by elaborate arrangements of hair. She was something else entirely, something that did not have a clean word in any Eastern vocabulary, but that Owen's Western-born mind recognized immediately as capable. She stood like someone who had earned the right to stand exactly where she wanted to stand, and she looked at the horses with the specific, focused attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. "Those mares belong to me," Owen said. Dorothy shifted her gaze to him. She looked at him the same way she had looked at the horses, appraisingly and without any attempt to soften the assessment. "They are good animals. Where did you acquire them?" "Bought them off a rancher near Medicine Lodge. He was selling out and moving his family back east." "What are you asking for them?" Owen told her a price. It was fair. She countered with a number that was slightly lower. It was also fair. They haggled for 4 minutes with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of two professionals who both knew the actual value of what was being discussed, and arrived at a price that split the difference cleanly. During those 4 minutes, Clyde Barris slipped away, and neither of them noticed. The transaction was completed at the livery office, a dim, hay-smelling room with a battered wooden desk and a stove that had not been lit since February. Dorothy produced a leather purse from her saddlebag and counted out payment in silver coin and 2 paper bills that were crisp enough to suggest recent banking. Owen wrote out a bill of sale on a piece of paper borrowed from the livery stock, and they both signed it. "You're not from Caldwell," he said when the business was finished. "No." She tucked the bill of sale into her saddlebag with the same careful precision she applied to everything. "I'm not from anywhere in particular." "You work the trail circuit." "I do. Horses, mostly." She paused, examining him with that direct gaze that he was beginning to find simultaneously disconcerting and fascinating. "And you?" "Same. I break them too when I have time. Military contracts when I can get them." She nodded, as though filing this information away for future reference. "Owen Atkins," she said, reading from the bill of sale. "I will look for you at the stock pens in Wichita. If you come across any more animals like those two, I would be interested." "I did not get your name." "Dorothy Yates." She picked up her saddlebags and turned toward the door. "Are you planning to stay in Caldwell tonight, Miss Yates?" She glanced back over her shoulder. "That depends on what business presents itself." And then she walked out into the bright morning sun. Owen stood in the livery office for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the doorway where she had been. Then he folded his copy of the bill of sale carefully, put it in his vest pocket, and went to find Clyde Barris. He found Barris at the Red Dog Saloon, which was the larger of Caldwell's 2 drinking establishments, a long, narrow room with a plank bar and 4 round tables, and a mirror behind the bar that was cracked down the middle and reflected everything in 2 slightly misaligned halves. Barris was at one of the tables, apparently in the process of buying a drink for 2 men Owen did not recognize, which suggested a level of prosperity that was infuriating given the unpaid debt. Owen sat down across from Barris without being invited and looked at him pleasantly. "Clyde," he said, "you were going to pay me before I got distracted. Let's finish that conversation." Barris looked at the 2 men he had been talking to, clearly calculating whether they constituted adequate backup. They did not look particularly interested in being involved. He reached into his coat and produced a small roll of bills, peeled off $40 with the bitter expression of a man parting with something considerably more valuable than money, and slid it across the table. Owen counted it, pocketed it, and stood up. Pleasure doing business. He was at the bar, considering whether he wanted a drink or lunch first, when Dorothy came through the saloon doors. She looked around the room with efficient curiosity, spotted the bar, and walked to it, setting her hat down on the wood beside her and running a hand over her pinned hair. "Do you have food?" she asked the bartender. "Bread and beans," he said. "Beef jerky if you want something cold." "Beans and bread, please." Owen was 3 feet to her right. He was aware of her with an acuity that was unusual for him. He was generally a measured person, not given to impulse or excessive reaction to things. He had liked women before, had been fond of a couple, had come close to something serious once with a schoolteacher in Dodge City before circumstances made it impossible. But this was something different. It was as though Dorothy Yates occupied some frequency that his particular internal compass had been calibrated to read, and it was ringing. He ordered the beans and bread as well, since he had been planning to eat anyway, and they sat at opposite ends of the bar in technically separate but practically adjacent meals for about 2 minutes before the awkwardness of pretending not to be aware of each other became more trouble than conversation. "Are the mares for resale or your own use?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "Resale. I have a buyer in Wichita who needs reliable trail stock. He will pay well for quality animals with good temperament." "What do you look for first? Conformation or temperament?" This question was more interesting to her than she had expected. Most people who asked about her work were performing curiosity without genuine interest. But the way he had phrased it suggested that he actually wanted to know her answer, and that he had a considered opinion of his own that he was prepared to defend or revise based on what she said. "They are not separable," she said. "A horse with perfect lines that will not settle under pressure is useless on the trail. But a horse with good heart and poor structure will break down before Wichita. You have to look at them together." "I agree with that completely," he said, and then told her about a system he had developed for evaluating horses, working from the ground up and then observing gait under both calm and stressed conditions. That was more detailed and thoughtful than anything she had heard from a man who was not already a recognized expert. They talked through the beans and bread, and then through the afternoon, and Dorothy was aware, somewhere around 3 o'clock, that she had been talking to Owen Atkins for 4 hours and had not once felt the faint impatience that typically crept in when she spent extended time with another person. She was not typically social. She did not dislike people, but she found sustained company exhausting in a way that solitude never was. She functioned best alone and had organized her life accordingly. Owen Atkins was not exhausting. He was, against all reasonable expectation, interesting. He was also clearly attracted to her, in a way that he was making no particular effort to conceal, but that he was equally not pressing in any awkward or demanding direction. He simply talked to her as though she were a person worth talking to, listened when she spoke, and looked at her occasionally with those dark eyes that held a warmth she had not been prepared for. She found this deeply suspicious. She excused herself around 4, citing the need to arrange stabling for her horse and a room at the hotel for herself, and told him she would see him when she saw him. He nodded and let her go without any of the maneuvering that lesser men had attempted. The next morning she ran into him at the stock pens on the east edge of town, where she had gone to look at a group of horses a rancher was moving through on his way north. The rancher, a weathered Texan named Abel Carter who had been moving cattle up the Kishom for 15 years, was surprised to see them both. "You two know each other?" he asked. "We conducted a transaction yesterday," Dorothy said. "She has good judgment," Owen added, which was an odd thing to say about a business acquaintance, but was the truest thing he could think of to say about her. Carter looked between them with the expression of a man who could read a more complicated situation than the one being described to him, but was polite enough not to comment on it. Dorothy focused on the horses. There was a bay gelding among Carter's string that had something wrong with his left front leg, a slight favoring that the animal tried to disguise but could not entirely hide, and she pointed it out to Carter, who had not noticed it. Carter was grateful for the information and more cautious about the 3 horses Dorothy subsequently offered to buy from his string than he might otherwise have been. Owen watched her work. He watched the way she moved around the animals, calm and deliberate, speaking to them in a low, continuous voice that seemed to communicate some kind of reassurance that the horses received and responded to. He watched how she ran her hands along a horse's legs with the focused attention of a physician, feeling for heat or swelling or irregularity. He watched how she made her offers, direct and fair, without the performative theater that most buyers employed. She was, he thought, the most competent person he had met in years, which was a thought that arrived with a warmth that surprised him. They rode out of the stock pens together, after her business with Carter was completed, without any formal agreement to do so. Their horses simply walked the same direction, and neither of them redirected. "I have to move those mares to Wichita by end of next week," Dorothy said. "The road north is pretty clear this time of year. Little water at Slate Creek after a dry march, but nothing that should give you trouble. Have you made that run recently?" "3 weeks ago." She was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon with those creekwater eyes. "Where are you heading after this?" "I have a contract to look at Army remounts at Fort Dodge. After that I had not decided." She looked at him then, and he could see her turning something over in her mind, weighing it. "I could use a second rider to move 8 horses north. The pay would not be significant." "I did not ask about pay," he said. She looked at him carefully. "I am saying the company would be the primary compensation." "I understand that. I do not require conversation." "I am saying that plainly." "Dorothy," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she noted it with a sharpness she had not expected. "I have spent most of the last 3 years in my own company, and I am comfortable there, but I would rather spend the next week in yours." She rode for another full minute without responding. Then she said, "We leave at first light." The drive north to Wichita took 6 days. 6 days of early mornings and long hours in the saddle, and the particular silence of 2 people who are comfortable with silence, but increasingly less comfortable with the distance the silence creates between them. Dorothy was, as she had warned, not particularly conversational. But what she did say was always worth hearing, and Owen found himself listening to her with an attention he had rarely given to anything. She talked about horses and trails and the logistics of moving animals across distance and terrain, and occasionally she talked about other things, about the nature of the sky in different kinds of weather, about the way towns were changing as the railroads moved in, and what that meant for people who made their living in the spaces between things. She was 26, and she had been running her own business for 2 years. Since the death of her father left her with a small amount of money, and a large amount of determination, and nowhere in particular that anyone expected her to be. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a man she did not name, who had expected her to fit herself into a life that felt to her like a room with no windows. She had ended the engagement 3 weeks before the wedding, and moved west 3 weeks after that, and she had not looked back with anything that resembled regret. Though she had looked back sometimes with the complicated feeling of someone who knows they made the right choice, but is also aware that right choices are not always comfortable ones. Owen listened to this without comment until she had finished. "The man did not deserve you," he said. "The man was not a bad person," she replied. "He simply wanted something I was not. And I was not interested in pretending." "No," Owen agreed. "You are not." She glanced at him. "You say that as a compliment. I say it as an observation that also happens to be a compliment." On the 3rd evening they camped beside a creek where cottonwoods stood in their early spring green, the leaves small and bright, and the creek running clear and cold over flat gray stones. Dorothy made coffee while Owen unsaddled and checked the horses, and they sat across the fire from each other, while the sun went down in shades of orange and deep red that painted the whole western sky like something out of a painting that no painter had yet been paid to make. "Why have you never married?" asked. Owen looked at her across the fire. The question was direct in the way she was direct, without social softening or pretense. "I was close to it once," he said. "Woman in Dodge City, school teacher, sensible, kind, beautiful in a quiet way." He paused. "She wanted me to stop being a lawman. She thought it was only a matter of time before the job killed me, and she was probably right. I tried to imagine the alternative for about 3 months, and I could not find it. So she found someone who could." "You regret it?" "I regret that I could not be what she needed, but not the choice itself. It would not have been honest to stay." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "We have that in common, then, the inability to be dishonest about what we are. Is that a flaw, do you think?" he asked. "The world would like it to be," she said, "particularly for women. There is an expectation that a woman of my age who has not settled into a domestic life is either unfortunate or defiant. People cannot quite decide which, so they land on pitying or disapproving depending on their mood. What do you land on when you think about it?" She looked at him steadily. "I land on satisfied. I have a life that is entirely my own. I go where I choose, I work when I choose, I answer to no one. There is a freedom in that which I do not think I could trade without losing something essential about who I am." Owen nodded slowly. "I understand that better than most people would." "I know you do," she said. "That is one of the interesting things about you." They looked at each other across the fire for a long moment, and the orange light played across her face and turned her auburn hair to something close to flame. And Owen thought that he had been a fool to think he was comfortable with solitude. Because this particular proximity to this particular woman, was something entirely different from being alone, and it was so much better that the comparison was almost painful. He did not say any of that. He poured more coffee and asked her about a route through the Flint Hills that he was considering for his return, and she answered him with the same focused practicality she brought to everything, and the fire burned down to coals while the stars came out over Kansas in their full, astonishing multitude. On the 4th day, they encountered trouble. It was not dramatic trouble. It was the mundane, infuriating kind, which in some ways was worse. 3 riders had been following them since late morning, keeping a distance that was designed to appear casual, but was too consistent to be accidental. Dorothy spotted them first. "We have company," she said without turning her head. Owen checked them in his peripheral vision. "I see them, 3, not in a hurry. They have been with us since that creek crossing around noon. Could be coincidental. Could be," she agreed. "But they are not." The horses she was moving were good stock, and good stock attracted the attention of people who made their living acquiring other people's property by force. It was a risk Dorothy was aware of on every drive. She was not afraid of it, but she was careful. "I have my rifle," she said, "and my revolver." "I am adequately armed," he said dryly. "I am not asking for reassurance. I am providing information." "I know you are." The riders were still following when they made camp that evening, still at their studied distance. Owen built the fire larger than he would otherwise have, and they positioned themselves with their backs to a limestone outcropping that provided cover from behind, and each of them maintained a casual vigilance through the evening that an observer might have mistaken for simple alertness to the night sounds of the prairie. Around 9 o'clock, one of the riders came in toward the firelight. He was a young man, no older than 22, with a poorly trimmed beard and nervous eyes, and he came with his hands visible in the deliberate manner of someone who had been coached on how not to get shot. "Evening," he said. "Saw your fire. Wondered if you might have coffee to spare." "We might," Dorothy said. "Leave your horse there and come in slow." He did as he was told, and Dorothy poured coffee into a tin cup with the unruffled hospitality of someone who had assessed the situation and made a decision. Owen sat across the fire, relaxed in posture and perfectly still in the way that men who have worked as lawmen learn to be when they are very alert. "You have 2 friends," Owen said pleasantly. Tell them to come in or ride out. Standing in the dark is nobody's idea of a good time." The young man looked uncomfortable. He called out to his companions, and after a moment of consultation they came in as well. Two more young men of similar age, all three of them shabby and trail-worn, and carrying the particular expression of people who had planned something, and were now reconsidering it in the face of circumstances that were not going according to the plan. Dorothy poured coffee for all three of them and said nothing about the fact that she had been aware of them since noon. She asked where they were coming from, and they said Texas, heading up to Wichita to look for work. She asked about their horses, and they answered, and by the time the coffee was gone, the situation had resolved itself without anyone doing anything dramatic, the young men having concluded that the horses were better guarded than they had anticipated, and the woman driving them considerably more alarming than they had expected. They slept across the creek and were gone before dawn. They were not very committed thieves, Owen observed the next morning. Most thieves are not, Dorothy said. The truly committed ones do not follow you for 6 hours without acting. They have the good sense to wait until dark. You sound disappointed. I am relieved. She glanced at him with a hint of something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I was also prepared. I know, he said. That is one of the interesting things about you. He had quoted her words back to her, and she recognized it, and there was a beat of something warm between them that neither of them named. Wichita in the spring of 1879 was a different animal than the cow town it had been 4 and 5 years earlier, when the cattle trade was at its height, and the streets ran thick with Texas cowboys and trail bosses, and the whole rowdy, violent commerce of the drives. The town had made attempts at respectability, new wooden storefronts with painted signs, a proper hotel, a newspaper office, a church that had been built with ambitions toward permanence. But it still smelled of the stockyards on the southern edge, and the saloons still operated at volume, and there was still enough of the old energy in the air that a person could feel it pressing against the newer, quieter version of Wichita that certain citizens were working hard to establish. Dorothy delivered the horses to her buyer, a man named John Whitfield, who operated a large horse and mule operation on the Wichita outskirts, and who had indeed paid well for the quality animals she brought him. She conducted the transaction with her characteristic directness and efficiency, and then she stood in Whitfield's corral afterward and felt the particular flatness that came after a job completed, the strange hollow of accomplishment. Owen had helped with the final day's drive and the delivery, and he stood beside her in the corral, also looking at the horses as they were led away. "What is next for you?" he asked. She had been asking herself the same question. She had 3 weeks before she had an appointment in Abilene to look at a string of Mustangs that a man there was selling. 3 weeks was enough time to go back south toward the Texas border and look for horses, or to work the local area, or to rest, which she rarely did and which she recognized as something her body was beginning to require with increasing insistence. "I am not certain," she said. This admission of uncertainty was rare enough for her that the words felt slightly strange. "I have to go to Fort Dodge and back," Owen said. "That is 4 days each way. After that I am free for a while." He paused. "There is a ranch outside of Caldwell where I have sometimes stayed when I was in between things. The family there is good people, the Hendersons. They would not mind a guest." Dorothy looked at him. "You are suggesting I wait in Caldwell for 10 days while you go to Fort Dodge." "I am suggesting no such thing," he said. "I am telling you where I will be in case you happen to be in the same area." She studied him for a moment. "You are very careful about not presuming. I have observed that presumption does not suit you." "It does not suit most people," she said. "They just do not usually know that." She looked back at the horses. "I will be in Caldwell, or near it, when you return from Fort Dodge." Owen's ride to Fort Dodge and back was the longest 8 days he could remember, and he was a man who had spent a significant portion of his life alone on the trail with nothing but a horse and the horizon for company. He thought about Dorothy Yates with an insistence that he would have found irritating if the thinking had not been so consistently pleasant. He thought about the way she held her coffee cup, both hands around it in the cold mornings, thumbs overlapping, as though the warmth were something she was going to hold onto by main force. He thought about the way she laughed, which happened rarely and without any of the performative quality that laughing sometimes acquired in social situations. It was a sudden, genuine sound that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, as though she were surprised by it. He thought about the way she smelled, which was horses and leather and something under those that was clean and faintly sweet, like creek water. He reached Fort Dodge, conducted his business with the quartermaster who was responsible for evaluating the Army's remount needs, which was tedious and involved more paperwork than anyone who had not dealt with the military would believe, and turned back toward Caldwell with a feeling of purpose that the drive north had not had. Dorothy, during those 8 days, found herself in a state of restless productivity. She spent 2 days exploring the area around Caldwell for horses she might buy cheaply and sell well, visited the Henderson ranch that Owen had mentioned simply because she was in the area, and Margaret Henderson turned out to be a woman of remarkable warmth and common sense who fed her a real meal, and talked to her about the country with the knowledge of someone who had lived in it for 12 years, and thought about Owen Atkins with a frequency that she found both irritating and telling. She did not want to be falling in love. This was a thought she had with clarity and without drama, sitting on the porch of the small hotel in Caldwell on the 6th evening of Owen's absence. She recognized what was happening with the same clarity she brought to everything else, because she was not a person who deceived herself, and what was happening was that she was falling in love with Owen Atkins, and everything about her independence and her chosen life and the clear-eyed assessment she had made of her own nature argued against it. She had meant what she said by the fire. She had a life that was entirely her own, and she valued it with a fierceness that was not casual. She was not the marrying kind. She had known that about herself with certainty for years, had stated it plainly to herself and to others, and she had not been performing practicality. It was the truth. And yet here was Owen Atkins, moving through her thoughts with the ease of someone who had been given the key by a door she had not known existed. She was sitting with this uncomfortable realization when he rode back into Caldwell on the evening of the 8th day, and she saw him coming down the main street from where she sat on the hotel porch, and something in her chest made a movement that she refused, entirely on principle, to call anything as dramatic as a leap. He spotted her on the porch and rode toward the hotel, swinging down with the loose ease of someone who had grown up doing it, and led his horse to the hitching post. He looked up at her and smiled, and it was such a genuinely glad smile, unguarded in a way that his face was not always unguarded, that she felt the principle she had been holding onto develop a small crack. "Good trip?" she asked. "Productive, dull, entirely too long." He tied his horse and came up the 2 steps to the porch. "You look rested." Margaret Henderson feeds people as though she is personally afraid of allowing starvation to exist within her radius, Dorothy said. "I ate well." "She does." He looked at her with that warm, steady attention. "Did you find horses?" "2 promising leads. I have appointments next week." She paused. "How long are you in Caldwell?" "I have no particular schedule." He sat down in the other chair on the porch, and they were close enough that the awareness of proximity was something she felt in her skin. "I have been thinking about something for the past 8 days." "What is that?" "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it honestly, which means I want to tell you something first." He was looking at the street, not at her, with the careful attention of someone choosing words. "I am not a man who has been looking for something. I have been, as you have, building a life that suits me, and I have found satisfaction in that. I am not sitting here with romantic delusions or an agenda I am concealing." "I did not think you were," she said. "No, but I want to say it plainly." He turned to look at her now. "The time on the trail with you was the best 10 days I have had in recent memory, and the 8 days at Fort Dodge were the longest of my life. I want to understand what that means before I pretend it means something less significant than it does." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. The sun was going down again because in her memory it seemed like the sun was always going down when Owen Atkins was saying something important, and the light was golden and slant across the porch boards. "It means something," she said carefully. "I am not willing to dismiss it. But—" He heard the word she had not spoken. "But I have been very honest with myself and with others about who I am. I'm not the marrying kind, Owen. I do not say that as a performance or as false modesty or to appear more independent than I am. It is simply the truth of my nature as I have come to understand it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that stopped her entirely. "Until about 10 minutes ago, I would have said the same thing about myself." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, which was somehow more alarming and more wonderful than if he had been joking. "That is not a small statement," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. I recognize that. I'm not asking anything of you, Dorothy. I am simply telling you the truth of where I find myself." She sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the particular gravity of honesty between two people who both had a constitutional inability to be less than completely straightforward. "You know this is entirely inconvenient," she finally said. "Entirely," he agreed. "I have appointments in Abilene in 3 weeks. I know. And I have built a life that works. I know that too. And I have no intention of becoming someone I am not in order to be what someone else needs." "Dorothy," he said quietly, "I have spent 2 weeks in your company. I'm not asking you to be someone you are not. The person you are is exactly the problem." She stared at him. "That is the strangest compliment I have ever received. It is the truest one I have ever given." He leaned back in his chair, and there was something in his posture that was almost rueful, the posture of a man who has realized something that reorganizes everything and is not sure whether to be grateful or exasperated about it. "I have been a lawman and a ranch hand and a horse trader, and I have told myself at every stage that my life suited me perfectly well as it was. And it did. Until I spent 6 days driving horses north with a woman who looks at the sky the way other people look at cathedrals and argues about horse conformation like it is a matter of personal honor, and I realized that suited me had been a very limited concept." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. The street below them was settling into the quiet that fell over Caldwell in the early evening, the particular piece of a town that had burned its energy for the day and was drawing a breath before the night. "I do not know how to do this," she said finally. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not. "I have organized my life very specifically to avoid exactly this kind of complication." "I know," he said. "I have done the same thing. So what do you propose?" He turned to look at her. "I propose that we continue doing exactly what we are doing. You go to your appointments, I go to mine, and we see where the trails overlap." She considered this. It was the most sensible romantic proposal she had ever encountered, which was perhaps what made it so difficult to argue with. "You are not asking me to change anything. I am asking you to let me keep showing up," he said. "That is all." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I cannot promise what this will become. I'm not asking for promises. I have enough of my own uncertainty." "Then yes," she said, "you may keep showing up." The smile that crossed his face was quiet and full of something she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. She thought the closest word for it was joy, though it was a restrained and careful joy, the joy of someone who has learned that good things require tending. That night she lay in her hotel room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the 10-minute mark that Owen had described. She thought about the way her own certainty had been operating, clear and absolute for years, that she was not built for the kind of permanence that marriage implied, that she was not interested in the particular negotiations of merging two lives. She thought about the way that certainty had felt slightly less absolute, not shattered but differently oriented, since about the second day on the trail north. She was afraid. This was worth acknowledging plainly, the way she tried to acknowledge everything. She was afraid of the vulnerability of wanting something from another person, of building a reliance that could collapse, of discovering that the freedom she had worked so hard to construct was incompatible with caring deeply about where someone else was, and whether they were safe and whether they were coming back. But she was also, underneath the fear, something else. She was the kind of person who did not look away from true things. And the truest thing she currently knew was that 8 days had felt like very long days, and that Owen Atkins's smile on the hotel porch had reorganized something in her. They spent 3 more days in Caldwell together. They rode out to look at the horses she had found, and his assessment confirmed hers, and she bought both animals. They ate meals together at the small restaurant that operated out of the back of the general store, where a woman named Clara Morrow produced food of surprising quality given her resources, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, moving easily between the practical and the philosophical in a way that Dorothy had not experienced with another person in years, if ever. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had been a farmer and a mother who had been a schoolteacher, about leaving at 18 with a clear sense that the fixed shape of that life was not for him, about the years of drifting that felt more like searching, about the law work in Dodge City and what it had required of him. He told her about the moral complications of being a lawman in a cow town, about the realities of maintaining order in a place where order was genuinely contested, about the things he had seen that he would carry forever. She told him things she had not told people in a long time. About her mother, who had died when Dorothy was 14, and the way that loss had altered her relationship with permanence in ways she had not fully understood until much later. About her father, who had taught her to ride and to evaluate horses and to read the sky for weather, and who had never once suggested that these skills were inappropriate for a girl to have. About the years after his death when she had been completely alone and had discovered, with something like relief, that she was sufficient to her own needs. Owen listened to all of this with the quality of attention that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, which was the attention of someone to whom the person speaking is genuinely interesting, not as a category or a type, but as a specific, irreplaceable individual. On the 3rd day, he helped her load her newly purchased horses for the drive toward Abilene, and they stood at the edge of town where the road went north and east, and there was a moment that was full of everything that had not been said and also everything that had been. "The Abilene trip is 10 days, she said. "I know. I will be in the country around here." He paused. "I may ride east to look at a string of horses a man in Newton is selling. Newton is between here and Abilene." "I am aware of that," he said, and there was the ghost of that smile. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she had not planned. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw briefly, with the same focused attention she brought to evaluating something of value. He went very still under her hand, not pulling away, not pressing forward, just receiving it with the quality of attention he gave to everything. "Do not be more than 3 days in Newton," she said. "I will make every effort," he said. She took her hand back and mounted, and she rode north without looking back, because she had learned long ago that looking back accomplished nothing useful. But she rode with a warmth in her chest that was entirely new and entirely undeniable. Owen was in Newton for 2 days. He found the horses, which were not as good as advertised, declined to purchase them, and turned east toward Abilene at a pace that would have struck a casual observer as slightly faster than necessary. He found Dorothy at the stockyards on the edge of Abilene on the afternoon of her 4th day there, where she was engaged in a spirited negotiation with a man who was selling a string of 7 Mustangs that had been partially broken. The Mustangs were rough and wary, but Dorothy had her eye on 2 of them, a gray and a dark bay, that had the bone structure and the eye quality that suggested they could become excellent animals with the right handling. The man selling them was named Ford Garrett, and he was a big, red-faced man with the confidence of someone who had rarely been successfully argued with. He was not finding Dorothy easy to argue with, and it was clearly an unfamiliar experience. Owen leaned against the fence and watched without interfering. He could see that she was winning, not by force but by the relentless application of accurate information. She kept citing the specific deficiencies of the horses in question, the roughness of the braking, the evidence of poor early handling, the additional work they would require before they were saleable. And she was citing these things with enough specific technical knowledge that Garrett could not dismiss them without either lying or revealing his own ignorance. She got her price. It was a good price. She did not appear particularly pleased with herself, because she had known from the beginning that it was the right price and had simply been waiting for Garrett to arrive at the same understanding. She turned from the corral and found Owen at the fence. Her expression did not change significantly, but her eyes did something that he was beginning to learn to read. "You are 4 days," she said. "I was 2 days in Newton and 2 days on the road. That is a reasonable accounting. The horses were poor quality." Completely misrepresented, he fell into step beside her as she walked toward where her own horses were stabled. "Those 2 Mustangs you bought are worth the work." "They are. The gray especially." She glanced at him. "Where are you staying?" "I have not yet arranged it. The hotel on 2nd Street is better than it looks." That evening they ate dinner at the hotel's small dining room, which was better than Dorothy's recommendation had suggested, and the conversation went the direction it was always going between them, which was everywhere and nowhere in particular, following the paths of their genuine mutual interest in everything the other thought and knew and had seen. After dinner, they walked the length of Abilene's Main Street in the warm spring evening, and Owen took her hand as they walked, not dramatically or with particular ceremony, just the simple fact of it, and she let him, and they walked the full length of the street and back with the easy comfort of people for whom this is not a surprising development so much as an acknowledgment of something already present. She stopped at the end of the street where the town gave way to the open prairie, and the grass went on forever in the dark, and the sky above it was absolute and full of stars. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what you said on the porch in Caldwell." "Which part?" "The 10 minutes part." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I have been thinking about when my 10 minutes was." He waited. "It was on the trail the second morning. You were checking the horses before dawn, and I was watching you from where I had the fire going, and you were talking to them." She paused. "Not to yourself, not making sounds to settle them. Talking. Having a conversation the way you would with a person." She turned to look at him. "And I thought that is a man I would like to know better, and then immediately after I thought that is dangerous. Because knowing someone better requires risking something," he said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I am still afraid of that." "I know." He held her hand a little more firmly. "I am also afraid of it." "You do not seem afraid." "I have had more practice at not appearing what I feel than at not feeling it." He looked at the stars as well. "Dorothy, I am not asking you to transform yourself or sacrifice the life you have built. I am not asking you to become something you are not, but I want you to know that I intend to be here, consistently, in whatever form you find useful. And if I decide eventually that the form I find useful is permanent." She said, which was not quite a question and not quite a statement, but something in between that she had arrived at without entirely knowing she was going to. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I would consider that a significant upgrade in my circumstances." She laughed. It was the sudden, genuine, vanishing laugh that had surprised him every time he heard it, and it surprised her too. "You are being careful with the language," she said. "I am being honest with the language. I am not making promises I do not know I can keep, but I know what I hope." "What do you hope?" He looked at her, and the starlight made his face into something that was not quite the daily face she knew but was more distilled, somehow, the essential part. "I hope that in a year or 2 years, or whenever the time comes when you are ready to say something definitive, that you will say it to me." He paused. "I hope that I am the person you decide to take a risk on, if you ever decide to take that risk at all." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped forward and kissed him, which was its own answer, as clear and direct as anything she had ever said in words. It was the kind of kiss that was not tentative, because neither of them was the tentative kind, but it was careful, and full of the particular tenderness of two people who have both been alone for a long time and know the value of what they are approaching. They spent 4 more days in Abilene before their separate business took them to separate places. She was going east to look at stock near Junction City. He was going southwest to check a contract opportunity near Medicine Lodge. They stood at the parting of the roads, and there was no drama because they were not dramatic people, but there was the clear, steady weight of something that had been established between them and was not going anywhere. "I will be back in Caldwell in 3 weeks," he said. "I will be through Caldwell in 2, she said. "Leave word at Henderson's if you are delayed." He nodded. He looked at her with everything in his eyes that his voice was not saying. "Owen," she said. "Yes." "I am still not entirely sure I am the marrying kind." "I know," he said, "but I am increasingly sure that I am the kind who wants to keep riding toward you." He smiled, and it was the good smile, the unguarded one, and he reached out and touched her face briefly with the back of his fingers, a gesture of such simple and genuine affection that it went through her like clear water. Then they rode their separate ways, and the Kansas prairie spread itself out around them in its enormous, indifferent beauty, and both of them were thinking about the place where the roads would come back together. The weeks that followed were not easy weeks, because good things in the making rarely are. Dorothy had a difficult stretch in Junction City, where the horses she had been promised turned out to be less than advertised, and she had to spend more time and money than she had planned to find alternatives. One of her pack animals threw a shoe on the road back west, and she spent a frustrating half-day at a small farm waiting for the smith who covered that area to come out. But the frustrations were livable in a way they had not always been, and she noticed this, because she noticed everything. The world had not changed. The road was still hard, and the horses were still sometimes disappointing, and the smith was still half a day late. But there was something in her interior landscape that was different, a point in the future that she was moving toward, and the knowledge of that point made the present distance manageable. Owen had a better few weeks. The Medicine Lodge contract came through, and he spent a week working with a string of horses that needed assessment and basic training before they could be delivered to a rancher who was building up his working stock after a bad winter. He was good at the training work, patient and methodical, and the horses responded well. He thought about Dorothy while he worked, which would have seemed like a distraction and turned out to be the opposite. Thinking about her somehow settled him, gave him a quality of attention that made his hands steadier and his voice with the animals more consistent. He arrived back at the Henderson Ranch outside Caldwell on a Tuesday morning to find that Dorothy had already been there 2 days. She was in the yard, talking to the oldest Henderson boy, a 14-year-old named James who had ambitions of working with horses and who had apparently found in Dorothy someone willing to answer his questions with a seriousness he rarely encountered. Owen watched her from the gate for a moment before she saw him. She was crouched down to James's level, drawing something in the dirt with a stick, explaining the structure of a horse's leg with the focused attention she brought to everything, and James was listening with the intensity of a person encountering information that matters to them. She was patient with him, genuinely patient, not the performed patience of someone enduring a bore, but the real thing, the attention of someone who respects the earnestness of someone learning. She saw him. She straightened up, said something to James, and walked across the yard, and he met her in the middle. "Good trip?" she asked. "Very," he looked at her. She looked tired, but well, the particular tired of someone who has been working hard at something they are good at. "You have been teaching the Henderson boy. He has good instincts. He needs someone to tell him that." She looked at him with her direct assessment. "You look rested." The Medicine Lodge work was satisfying. He paused, and then, because he had been planning this for 2 weeks, "Dorothy, I would like to take you to dinner, not at Clara Morrow's back room. There is a proper restaurant opened on the north end of Caldwell, I am told, with actual chairs and a menu." She blinked at him slightly. "A proper dinner. "A proper dinner," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment, and then the ghost of that smile appeared. "Then I suppose I should change out of my trail clothes." The restaurant was called Mabel's, and it was indeed a proper establishment by the standards of a Kansas cattle town in 1879, with white tablecloths that had seen better days but were at least present, and a handwritten menu card that offered 3 entrees and 2 desserts, and candles on the tables that were made from actual wax rather than tallow and burned with a cleaner, steadier light. Dorothy had changed into the dress she kept folded in her saddlebag for occasions that required it, a dark blue wool with white collar and cuffs that she wore with the same ease she wore everything, without self-consciousness or particular acknowledgement that she looked quite wonderful in it. Owen had found a barber earlier in the afternoon and come to the restaurant with his hair trimmed properly and his jaw clean-shaved for the first time since Caldwell, and Dorothy looked at him across the white tablecloth with the assessment she could not quite turn off and thought that he had an entirely good face, and that the good-heartedness in it was not something that the shave or the haircut had created, but was simply more visible without the trail wear around it. They talked because they always talked, but the conversation that evening had a different quality, softer around the edges, less strictly informational, moving into territory that was more personal and more careful. He talked about what he wanted, not in practical terms of contracts and horses, but in the larger sense. She listened and found that what he described did not require her to be absent from it. She talked about fear, about the specific fear of permanence, which was not fear of commitment in the abstract but a deeper and more personal thing, the fear of a life becoming smaller, of losing the width and freedom of the existence she had built for herself. "I have been watching you," he said, "since Caldwell, and I think you may be afraid of something that I do not intend to do to you, which is make you smaller." He was very direct and very clear. "Dorothy, you are one of the most capable people I have ever met. I am not interested in a version of you that has been diminished to fit a domestic framework. I find you entirely overwhelming in the best possible way exactly as you are." She looked at him across the candles. "Most men," she said carefully, "say something like that, and what they mean is that they find independence attractive as a quality until it becomes an inconvenience." "I know that is the pattern," he said. "I cannot prove to you by words alone that I am not that pattern. I can only tell you that I am aware of it, and that I am asking to be given the chance to demonstrate the difference." He paused. "And also that I have a horse trading operation that requires a great deal of travel, and I have no interest in asking you to stop traveling for a life that does not travel." She was quiet for a long moment. The candle between them flickered in a draft from the door. "Owen," she said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "I am proposing that we stop operating as 2 separate enterprises and start operating as one, in whatever form that takes. The horses, the contracts, the trail work, together." He paused. "And eventually, if you ever decide you want to be married, but that is not the main proposal. The main proposal is the partnership." Dorothy Yates, who had outmaneuvered horse traders and trail bosses and 3 would-be thieves on a dark prairie, sat across from Owen Atkins in Mabel's restaurant in Caldwell, Kansas, and felt the last of her careful, reasonable resistance simply let go, not with drama but with the quiet inevitability of something that had been holding against a current for a long time and finally stopped holding. "I accept the proposal," she said. "The partnership." "And the other?" She looked at him steadily. "Give me until the end of summer." He nodded, accepting this with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. "I can do that." "And Owen," she said, "I want it clearly understood that if we are running a joint operation, I have equal say in every decision." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and he meant it so completely that she believed him without qualification. They sealed it with a handshake that turned, when their hands met, into something that held for a long moment, his large, warm hand around hers, her fingers curling slightly to meet his. The summer of 1879 was a good summer. They worked the trail circuit together, moving horses between Kansas and the Indian Territory border and the military posts, and the ranches that were spreading across the plains with the persistence of people who believed in permanence. They developed a working method that was efficient in ways neither of them had been entirely alone. Dorothy's eye for individual animals combined with Owen's relationships with military buyers, her negotiating precision with his broader geographic knowledge of where the demand was sharpest. They were good together in the practical sense, which in a working partnership was the essential thing. But they were also, increasingly, good together in every other sense, in the way they occupied shared space without friction, in the way their humor aligned around the same dry, observational humor of people who watched the world with attention and noticed its absurdities, in the way that the trail, which had always been lonely even when she would not have admitted it, was now simply long, with a distinction between those two qualities that she had not fully appreciated until she had the comparison. She taught him to read the bone structure of horses with the specificity she had developed, and he taught her things about military procurement that opened new avenues she had not considered. She told him about the injustice she had navigated, the reality of being a woman doing work that the world considered male territory, the extra layer of proof required, the condescension that she dealt with in every new location until she had established her reputation through demonstration. He listened to this without the defensive minimizing that many men performed, and he was genuinely angry on her behalf in a way that was useful rather than dramatic. "It is a theft," he said, one evening when she had described a particularly egregious example, a buyer in Ellsworth who had initially refused to do business with her at all, until she had publicly identified 3 problems with his horses that his own expert had missed. "They are stealing your time and your energy by requiring you to prove things you should not have to prove." "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is." The simple act of having it named accurately was something she had not expected to matter as much as it did. "When we are operating jointly," he said, "I want you to use my name when it is useful. Not as something I am giving you, but as a tool that belongs equally to both of us." She thought about this. "That is a practical offer. I know it is also something that should not be necessary," he said, "but it is." "Yes," she agreed, "it is." They had a good working rhythm by July, moving with the efficiency of people who understand each other's methods well enough to anticipate and complement them. They had also, in the quieter moments of those summer months, moved into a closeness that was so natural and so clearly right that neither of them spent much time discussing it, because there was nothing to argue with. He was a person who noticed things. He noticed when she was tired and never said so directly, which would have annoyed her, but instead suggested practical stops or adjusted the day's plan in ways that were useful rather than pointed. He noticed her moods without making her feel observed, which was a gift she had not known she needed until she had it. She noticed these things back at him, though her version looked different because they were different people, and what she gave was a quality of absolute reliability and the particular comfort of being known without performance. By the end of July, she had stopped thinking of herself as someone for whom love was a poor fit, the way a garment can be wrong for a body and create nothing but chafing and constraint. She had discovered that she had been right, in a sense, for many years. She had been right that the version of love and marriage she had been shown and offered was not for her. She had simply been incorrect in assuming that this version was the only one available. What Owen offered was not diminishment dressed in romantic language. It was a genuine partnership between 2 people who were each, frankly, better with the other than without, and who both knew it, and who had both decided, with the clear eyes of people who had made enough good and bad decisions to tell the difference, that this was worth something permanent. She told him she was ready in August. They were camped beside the same creek in the Flint Hills where they had camped on the first drive north, and the cottonwoods were fuller now in their summer green, and the creek ran lower than it had in spring but with the same clear sound over the same flat gray stones. "I am ready," she said, without any particular preamble because there was no need for one. He looked at her across the fire. "Ready for what specifically?" he said, with the ghost of a smile that knew exactly what she meant and was giving her the room to say it. "To be the marrying kind," she said, "if the offer is still on the table." "The offer," he said carefully, "has been sitting on the table waiting for you since approximately the second day on the trail to Wichita." She laughed, the sudden genuine one. "That was a very early beginning. I told you, 10 minutes. You said 10 minutes in Caldwell. We were in Wichita." "I was being conservative with the timeline," he said. She looked at him across the fire, this man she had known for 4 months and would know. She was now entirely clear for the rest of her life. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her with everything that was real and steady and good about him. "Dorothy Yates," he said. "Will you marry me and continue to be exactly who you are, and run this enterprise with me as equal partners, and ride north and south and east and west as the work requires, and tell me the truth always, because I cannot imagine any life worth having that does not have you in it?" She thought she had never been asked anything so well in her life. "Yes," she said. "To all of it. Yes." They were married in Caldwell in September, in the small church that had been built with ambitions toward permanence, on a Saturday afternoon when the Kansas sky was the kind of blue that made people believe in things. Margaret Henderson was there, and John Whitfield from Wichita, and Abel Carter, who had driven cattle north and who wept without any apparent embarrassment, which turned out to be a character trait Dorothy found she respected. Dorothy wore the dark blue dress and pinned her hair up and wore a small spray of prairie wildflowers that she had picked herself that morning, with the focused attention she brought to everything. Owen wore a suit that he had purchased in Wichita specifically for the occasion, and that fit him well enough that Dorothy told him so plainly, which made him smile with a pleasure he did not try to conceal. The minister who performed the ceremony was a young man named Reverend Caldwell, who had been in Caldwell for only 8 months, and was still finding his footing in a town that was not exactly the congregation he had imagined when he had entered the ministry. He performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and a brevity that both Dorothy and Owen appreciated, and when he asked if they took each other, they both said yes with the clarity of people who had made a decision with their whole minds and were not interested in ambiguity. Margaret Henderson, sitting in the first pew, cried quietly and happily, and James Henderson, sitting beside her, tried not to show that he was moved and mostly succeeded. The practical reality of their married life was not very different from the practical reality of the summer, because the summer had been, in every way that mattered except the legal one, already the life they were building. They traveled together, worked together, made decisions together with the collaborative efficiency of two people who each trust the other's judgment absolutely. They took a short honeymoon, 3 days at a hotel in Wichita that was significantly better than the one in Caldwell, where Dorothy allowed herself to be extravagant by the standards of a woman who slept in trail camps most of her life, ordering proper meals from the hotel dining room and sleeping in a real bed with a feather mattress, and staying in it until the sun was fully up, which felt like a staggering indulgence. Owen watched her enjoy it with the particular happiness of someone watching a person they love have something good. He was aware that this woman he had married was not practiced at receiving comfort, at allowing herself to be provided for in any direction, and that when she let herself have it, it was meaningful. "You could allow this more often," he said on the second morning, when she had indeed slept until the sun was up and was sitting in the window with coffee looking at the street below with the look she had when she was thinking. "I could," she agreed. "The trail does not permit it as a rule." "The trail permits more than you allow yourself." She looked at him. "You are suggesting I am unnecessarily austere." "I am suggesting that you have spent a long time taking very good care of your operation and very efficient care of yourself, and that those two things are not always the same." She was quiet for a moment. "You are not wrong." "I am frequently not wrong," he said mildly. "That is a genuinely irritating quality in a husband," she told him, and drank her coffee. The fall of 1879 brought new contracts and new routes, and the particular satisfaction of a business that was genuinely thriving under their combined attention. Dorothy's eye for horses and Owen's knowledge of the military market and the major ranching operations proved to be a combination that gave them access to deals that neither could have reached separately. They moved horses from the Texas border to the Kansas line, and from Kansas east to the Missouri border, where the railroad was creating demand for good working stock to service the new farms and settlements spreading across the state. They wintered in Caldwell, taking a proper room at the hotel for the worst months, and using the Henderson Ranch as a base of operations for the smaller work they did in the cold months, breaking horses and building relationships with ranchers who would need stock in the spring. Margaret Henderson treated them with a warmth that was entirely without presumption, never suggesting that Dorothy should do anything other than what she was doing, which Dorothy noticed and valued. James Henderson continued his education in horses under Dorothy's occasional guidance, and by the end of the winter could evaluate a horse's legs and feet with a competence that pleased her. She told him so plainly because she was not a person who withheld deserved praise, and the boy stood 2 inches taller afterward. Spring of 1880 arrived with the news that Dorothy was expecting their first child. She discovered this in March, when the season was just starting, and she received the information with the same analytical attention she brought to any new variable in her life. She was not afraid of it exactly. She was uncertain about the practicalities, about what it would mean for the trail work, about the adjustment required. "We will figure it out," Owen said, and said nothing else, because he knew her well enough to know that what she needed was not reassurance in the form of predictions or promises about things that had not happened yet, but the simple statement of his presence in the facing of whatever came. "The summer work should be possible until late July," she said, already thinking through the timeline. "Probably," he agreed. "We will be flexible. I do not intend to disappear from the business for longer than is genuinely necessary." "I know," he said. "I also know that some portion of what is genuinely necessary will be longer than you currently believe." She looked at him. "You are doing the not wrong thing again." "I will attempt to distribute it less frequently," he said. She laughed the laugh, and he kissed her, and outside the window the Kansas prairie was beginning its annual miracle, the winter brown giving way in patches to the first pale green that would spread until the whole enormous landscape was a living thing again. Their son was born in October of 1880 in Caldwell at the Henderson farm, with Margaret Henderson and a midwife named Clara, who was also, coincidentally, the Clara Morrow who ran the restaurant from the back of the general store, and who turned out to be both an excellent cook and a competent presence in the delivering of babies. Owen spent the hours of labor in the yard with Bill Henderson, trying to be useful to the horses and largely failing to think about anything except what was happening inside the house. When Margaret came to the door and told him he had a son, he stood very still for a moment, and then walked inside with the careful step of someone who is aware that everything has changed and is adjusting to it. Dorothy was tired and pale and entirely herself, sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms and looking at this new person with the focused, serious attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. She looked up when Owen came in. "Come and see," she said. He sat beside her and looked at the baby, who was red-faced and asleep and entirely astonishing in the way that all babies are astonishing, the fact of them, the sudden reality of a person who was not there before and now entirely is. "He looks like someone who will have opinions," Owen said. "Everyone in this family has opinions," Dorothy said. He looked at her with everything he had, all of it, and she looked back with the same completeness. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "And very glad he is here, and very interested in a great deal of sleep." He took the baby so she could sleep, and he sat by the window in the quiet of the October evening with this new small person sleeping in his arms, and felt the particular quality of a life that has become more than you knew to hope for. They named him Thomas, after Dorothy's father. Thomas was 7 months old when Dorothy returned to the trail circuit in the spring of 1881, a timing that was 4 months later than she had originally planned, because she had discovered that what was genuinely necessary was indeed, as Owen had gently noted, longer than she had believed. She discovered also that leaving was harder than she had expected, not because she did not want to go, but because the wanting was different now, more complicated, layered with a new love that had not been part of the accounting before. But she went. Owen stayed with Thomas for the first 2 weeks, working the local business they had developed around Caldwell. And then Margaret Henderson took the baby with the enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting for someone to ask her to do exactly this. And Owen rode to meet Dorothy at Medicine Lodge to look at a string of horses that was coming up from Texas. They were both better for the reunion, and neither of them mentioned that separately they had each had the experience of the past 3 weeks and registered it as something they did not prefer to repeat more than was necessary. Their working arrangement shifted somewhat after Thomas, as all working arrangements do after a baby makes the general scheme of things more complex. They were less likely to be simultaneously on the road for extended periods, working out a rotation that kept one of them closer to home base while the other covered longer distances. It required more planning and more coordination, which they were both good at, and it required the continued support of Margaret Henderson, who they compensated fairly, and who provided a stability for Thomas that Dorothy was grateful for with a gratitude she expressed directly, because she was still not a person who withheld things that needed to be said. In 1882, when Thomas was 18 months old and beginning the serious business of walking everywhere he was not supposed to walk, Dorothy was expecting again. She received this news with somewhat more equanimity than the first time, having the benefit of experience and also with a happiness that she did not feel the need to qualify or make smaller. 2, Owen said when she told him. 2, she confirmed. Thomas is going to have opinions about that, he said. Thomas has opinions about everything, she said. He gets that from his father. Owen looked at her with the expression that she had catalogued over the years, the one that was all warmth and all genuine, the one that had appeared for the first time on a hotel porch in Caldwell in the early evening of 1879. Is that right? He said. Entirely, she said. Their daughter arrived in the fall of 1882, which was a good fall, cool and clear, the Kansas sky doing its autumn work of being more dramatic and beautiful than any season had the right to be. They named her Frances, which had been Owen's mother's name, and she arrived with a full head of dark hair and a pair of eyes that would settle, over the next months, into the same creek-water gray-green as her mother's. Thomas, at 20 months, regarded his sister with the solemn suspicion of someone being asked to share a world that had previously been adequately organized, without additional occupants. He came around gradually, as children do, and by the time Frances was 3 months old he had developed the proprietary affection of an older sibling that would define his relationship with her for the rest of their lives. The business continued to grow. The Atkins horse and mule operation, as they had formally named it when they registered with the county office in 1880, was by 1883 one of the more established enterprises of its kind between Wichita and the Texas border. Dorothy's reputation had solidified to the point where buyers sought her out specifically, which was a satisfaction that had not dulled with familiarity. Owen's military contracts provided a stable revenue base that freed them to be more selective about the other work they took. James Henderson, now 17, had begun working for them on a formal basis, doing trail work under Owen's supervision, and he had the quality that Dorothy had identified in him at 14. Genuine aptitude combined with the willingness to learn that made aptitude something more than potential. In the spring of 1884, They did something they had been discussing for 2 years. They bought land. A small parcel east of Caldwell, 80 acres with a creek and good grass, and a location that was favorable for the kind of operation they were building. They built a proper house on it, nothing extravagant but solid and well-made, with enough rooms for the family they had, and the space to grow if the family continued in that direction. Dorothy stood in the doorway of the finished house on the day they moved in, and looked at it with the same quality of attention she had always brought to things she was trying to understand. Owen came to stand beside her, and Thomas, now 4 years old and in possession of enough language to be perpetually interesting, came to stand between them and look at the house with the earnest assessment of a child who is taking something seriously. "Our house," Thomas announced, as though this were a declaration rather than a statement. "Our house," Dorothy confirmed. Owen put his hand on her shoulder and she leaned slightly, just slightly, into it. The house was not the end of the traveling. The trail work continued, though with the land as a base and the structure of a more settled life to return to. Dorothy still rode out for extended trips 3 or 4 times a year, and Owen did the same, and they worked the local operations from the ranch in the intervals. It was a life that moved, which was what both of them had always needed, but it was also a life that had a place to come home to, which turned out to be something they had both needed without knowing it. Thomas grew into a boy of remarkable earnestness and a remarkable amount of opinions, as both his parents had predicted. He was interested in horses from the age of 2, which Dorothy facilitated with the serious, dedicated instruction she had given James Henderson, and he showed an aptitude that she recognized with a pleasure that was both parental pride and something more fundamental, the pleasure of seeing a true thing about the world confirmed. Frances, from the time she could talk, was interested in everything, which was a quality that required a great deal of energy to keep up with and was also, Dorothy reflected, perhaps the finest thing a child could be. She was curious and demanding and funny, and she had Owen's talent for reading people, which meant she always knew when anyone near her was in a complicated state long before they had articulated it themselves. In the fall of 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Frances was 3, Dorothy discovered she was expecting a third child. She was 32 years old, and she received this news with the equanimity of someone who has made peace with the full scope of the life she is living, including its surprises. 3, Owen said when she told him. 3, she confirmed. He looked at her with those warm brown eyes that had not changed in 5 years of marriage from the way they had looked at her across a fire on the first night of the trail drive to Wichita. "Are you pleased?" he asked. She considered this with her characteristic honesty. "I am," she said, "which continues to surprise me in the best possible way." "The life suits you," he said. "Our life suits me," she corrected. "The life you and I specifically built." "That is the distinction." He looked at her with a smile. "The life we built from 2 horse traders who had no intention of marrying." "I had no intention," she said. "You apparently had intentions from approximately the 2nd day of our acquaintance." "I told you, 10 minutes. You were being conservative," she agreed. The third child, another boy they named Arthur, arrived in the spring of 1886 with the loud, certain conviction of a person who has important things to say and intends to say them immediately. He arrived into a house that already knew how to hold children, and he was received with the warmth of people who had discovered that love did not divide when more was required of it, but rather multiplied in a direction that could not quite be predicted in advance. Thomas, at 6, took Arthur's arrival as an occasion to become someone's older brother again, with the authority this implied, and Frances, at 4, took it as an occasion to demonstrate that she had always been the middle child of the family even before there was a middle position to occupy, which she had been preparing for without knowing it. The years settled into themselves, the way years do when a life has found the shape it is meant to have. Dorothy Yates, who had ridden into Caldwell with a rifle across her saddle and eyes that could freeze a rattlesnake, and who had been, she said with absolute certainty, not the marrying kind, ran a thriving horse operation with her husband, and raised 3 children on 80 acres of Kansas prairie, and continued to read the sky and the land and the horses with the focused attention she had always brought to everything. Owen Atkins, who had arrived at the same conclusion about himself at approximately the same moment, and for approximately the same reasons, broke horses and managed contracts and negotiated prices, and came home every time the road brought him back to the house on the creek east of Caldwell, and understood with increasing clarity every year that the 10 minutes in question, the 10 minutes on a hotel porch when he had said I was not the marrying kind either, until now, had been the most important and correctly calculated 10 minutes of his life. In the summer of 1888, James Henderson, now 23 and working as the full-time trail manager of their operation, announced that he was planning to marry a young woman from Wichita, and Dorothy went to meet her with the same focused assessment she brought to everything, and determined within the first half-hour that the young woman was entirely worthy of James, which she told him in those exact terms. And James said that coming from Dorothy Atkins, those were the most reassuring words he had ever heard. Thomas, at 8, asked his mother that fall why she and his father had not met until they were old. Dorothy considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "We were not particularly old," she said, "and we met when we were ready." "How do you know when you are ready?" he asked with the focused, serious expression that was entirely hers. "You stop being so certain you are not," she said. He thought about this. "That does not sound like a plan," he said. "No," she agreed. "But some of the best things that happen are not plans." She paused. "Your father is the finest example I know." Owen, passing through the kitchen on his way to the barn, caught the end of this exchange, and the look that passed between him and Dorothy over the boy's head was the look of 2 people who have built something real and good and know it, who have looked at the improbable fact of their life together, and found it more than they had believed possible when they were, separately, people who had decided with great certainty that they were not the marrying kind. The years went on being the years that they were. Good years mostly, with the difficulty and beauty that a life lived fully contains. The horse business grew and contracted and grew again with the changes of the cattle industry, the railroad expansion, the shift in the kind of work horses were needed for as the territory around them settled into a different version of itself than it had been when Dorothy first rode into Caldwell. They adapted because they were both people who adapted, who paid attention to what the world was doing and adjusted their thinking accordingly. Owen's hair went gray at the temples by the time he was in his 40s, and Dorothy wore hers in a slightly simpler style than the elaborate fashions of the day, but let the auburn go its natural way as it began to silver at the edges, and neither of them spent much time thinking about it, because there was always too much else to think about. Thomas, by the time he was 17, was managing significant portions of the trail work himself, and Dorothy watched him negotiate with a buyer twice his age with the direct, informed confidence of someone who has been taught the trade by people who knew it thoroughly, and felt a satisfaction that was as complete as anything she had ever known. Frances, at 15, announced that she wanted to become a doctor, which was a statement that landed with different weight in different parts of the family's social world, Margaret Henderson receiving it with warmth and the minister at the Caldwell church receiving it with somewhat more uncertainty. Dorothy received it the way she received all true statements about the nature of the people she loved. "Then we will find out how to make that possible," she said. Owen said the same, because they were people who had always said the same things about the people they loved and what those people were capable of. Arthur, the youngest, grew into a child who was interested in mechanical things, a quality that was increasingly useful in the world that 1890s Kansas was becoming, with its new machines and its new structures and its slow, complicated transformation into something different from the territory where Dorothy had first ridden with a rifle across her saddle, and made a business out of knowing the worth of good horses. On a September evening in 1891, Dorothy and Owen sat on the porch of the house on the creek east of Caldwell, the house they had built in 1884, the house that had become the fixed point around which their wide and traveling life organized itself. The children were inside, in various states of the complicated, noisy business of being children of different ages under one roof. The horses were in the pasture below the creek bank, dark shapes against the grass in the falling light. The Kansas sky was doing its autumn work, the colors more extravagant than anything a person in a city would believe possible, orange and deep pink, and a red along the horizon that shaded into the blue-purple of the coming night with the slow, gorgeous deliberateness of something that has all the time in the world. Dorothy had a cup of coffee, both hands around it, thumbs overlapping, the way she had always held a cup in the morning cold that had been one of the first things Owen had memorized about her. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that 12 years ago I was very certain about something." He looked at her and the smile was there, the one that had not changed in 12 years. "And," he said. "And I was right," she said, which was not what he had expected, and he looked at her with the question in his eyes, and she continued. "I was right that I was not the marrying kind in the way that word had always been used around me. I was not the kind of woman who would dissolve into a domestic framework and call that a life. I was never that kind. I was correct about it." "You were," he agreed. "But the word was too small," she said. "The definition I had been given was too small. And you—" She looked at him across the porch, across 12 years and 3 children and 10,000 miles of trail, and a horse operation they had built from a 2-horse transaction in a livery office. "You had a different definition." "I had the right one," he said quietly. "You did," she agreed. "You had a definition that was large enough for both of us to live in without shrinking." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, the way he had on the main street of Abilene on a spring evening years ago, with the simple certainty of someone who knows where his life is located. "Dorothy Atkins," he said. "Owen Atkins," she returned. Below them the horses moved in the evening pasture, dark and calm. Inside the house, Thomas was arguing with someone about something with the passionate conviction of a boy who has inherited his parents' inability to let a wrong statement pass unchallenged. Francis's voice said something precise and cutting that resolved the argument in about 4 words, which was a very efficient deployment of the intelligence she was going to spend her life making use of. Arthur, 4 years old, was almost certainly doing something with the fire poker that was not strictly what fire pokers were meant for. The autumn sky above the Kansas prairie continued its extravagant work, spending itself on colors that nobody had asked for and that were given anyway, given freely and without expectation of return, the way the best things always were. Dorothy drank her coffee and looked at the sky and held her husband's hand, and the life she had built, the life that was entirely and specifically hers, wide and traveling and full of the work she had always been made for, was also, now and here and completely, the life she had never known to plan for. The creek ran below the bank, the same clear sound it had always made over flat gray stones, and the October air was cool and full of the smell of grass and horses, and the particular Kansas autumn that she had come to know the way she knew everything she loved, deeply and with her full attention, and without any desire for it to be anything other than what it was. She had said she was not the marrying kind, and she had been telling the truth, as she always told the truth, with the particular accuracy of someone who sees things clearly. She had simply not yet met the man who would show her, with 10 quiet minutes on a porch in the last light of a spring evening, that the category she had built so carefully for herself had room for one more thing, one more true and irreplaceable thing that she had not been looking for, and could not in the end choose not to have. And Owen Atkins, who had said the same thing about himself and meant it with equal conviction, sat beside her in the fall evening of a life they had built deliberately and together, and thought that the 10 minutes in question had been the best investment of time he had ever made, and that the return on it, in 12 years of Dorothy and Thomas and Francis and Arthur and horses and trail, and the specific quality of this woman's laughter when something was genuinely funny, was so far beyond anything he could have calculated that the word enough was entirely insufficient, and the only word that worked was more, and always more.